And so with his power base here, his power base was based on the dry side or the lee side of the Big Island. Now this whole area here was in agriculture. This was the classic dryland forest agricultural system, which generated enormous amounts of produce. And we have a ton of great accounts from Europeans that would land down at Kealakekua, and would then, walk up to see the volcano, to see Kilauea. And in doing so, they almost invariably would describe the landscape they went through. And they were constantly amazed at the enormous amount of agriculture and the large number of people they saw. This was relatively recent. In fact, this postdates our pile stuff we were talking about before. Prior to the 1600s, the Big Island was actually probably less populated than the other islands. So sort of like it is now in terms of relative size versus population. Your population base was Maui and Oahu. With the development of this huge dryland agricultural system, which the Big Island, of course, has the most property with, then you get this massive population increase in the 1700s. And that's why the Big Island chiefs could afford to pick fights with everyone, because suddenly they had this huge population base. They had resources in terms of food. And so they went out and run around, had attitude, sort of tried to beat the crap out of everyone. And of course, everyone else returned the favor. So Kamehameha's power base is here. Now, on one hand, he knew that. I mean, the guy was incredibly smart, but he also was blinded by virtue of the norms in the world he lived in. And the norms in the world he lived in was this is the way the world is, and this is the way it's sort of going to stay. Now, the thing about these dryland agricultural systems, if you notice, there's not a lot of water here. These dryland ag systems are entirely based on a very complex system, which usually doesn't show up very well here. But if you actually walk on this landscape, you'll see this whole landscape has rows and rows and rows of sort of goofy looking walls going for miles. The Kohala field system, I think, is 27 miles. Kona field system is 32 or something like that, 20, 30 miles at a time. And basically everything from right about here all the way up slope to where the Waimea town now was all in these field systems. So it's literally miles and miles of agricultural production going on here. And that, that's where its power came from. That's where the food came from. But what it didn't generate is it didn't generate money. So Kamehameha comes to power. He's in the Big Island. The Europeans are showing up. The Europeans have this new tech. And what he's really interested in, of course, is military tech, especially muskets and cannon. Because if he has these things, and most importantly, he can get more than his neighbors, he can go and blow the crap out of them and then win a battle. And then he wins the war, and then he wins the islands. In fact, that's what he did. So he had to find ways to convert what he had, which was real estate and people and food, into something the Europeans wanted. What the Europeans wanted was, this is where his discussions in Vancouver start up. He and Vancouver have these long discussions back when he's still just a regional chief about how to make money and how to be successful in the European-based global economy of this period. And so what that discussion ends up being. Oh, okay. No, missionaries haven't arrived yet. Someone's asking how he's able to communicate. Missionaries don't show up till way after this. Missionaries are 1821, and we're talking 1790s. You have to remember that he didn't know English per se, but especially the British that show up all speak Tahitian. This was, all these guys, even in Vancouver's expedition, the second British expedition, were officers under Cook. Most of them were on their second and third voyage in the Pacific. All your officers in the British expedition could speak Tahitian because they had spent time down there. Cook, for example, was pretty fluent in Tahitian. Cleric was a real good speaker. Vancouver was pretty good. And of course, the large proportion of them had been to Hawaii once before. It only been for a little while. But between their Tahitian competency and what little they picked up of Hawaiian, they could communicate. So it wasn't a grunt and point type thing. These folks could talk to each other. So in that situation, yeah, they could communicate. And Kamehameha, of course, was a very quick learner. He very quickly learned concepts in English as they would translate into Hawaiian and vice versa. And so, yeah, these guys are actually talking. I think that's a good point because I don't think people realize that. And this, again, it's an important thing, really, because this always drives me crazy. The missionaries occur way after all this stuff. The missionaries are still, 30, 40 years down the road. So Hawaiians became literate in English way before they became literate in English way before they learned before writing system showed up. So one of the key things about all this is he's quizzing all these folks and very quickly realizing, Vancouver points out, that one of the things the Europeans really wanted and needed, if that they were willing to trade for, was meat. And by this we mean salt meat, which is sort of like somewhere between well, it's pipikala is modern salt meat. So you butcher a cow or a pig or something like that, you pickle it in salt, and then it survives for months. And you have to remember, you didn't have refrigeration. So these European vessels went through enormous amounts of meat because that was the only protein they had on board pretty much. So he gets pointed out by all these guys. If you want to make money and if you want to trade something for guns or cannon, the only thing that the Europeans are going to be willing to cough up guns and cannon for is salt meat, specifically salt beef. So in that situation, Vancouver gives him some of these animals, and Kamehameha immediately puts a kapu on them. Now the kapu he puts on is the typical one that chiefs put on stuff, which is basically, if you touch or harass these animals, we're going to kill you on the spot. So he basically lets these animals run around, and the animals are let go right in this region here, and they start wandering around. Now, the field systems that the Hawaiians had were just open rows of plants growing in, rows going for a mile. There were no fences. If you had a fence, it was made out of stones, which even cattle can go over with no trouble at all. And of course, you weren't allowed to throw rocks or harass these animals because the high chief would literally have your arms and legs broken and sacrifice you on a hill. So what happens very quickly is the animals run rampant. The cattle, the goats, and the sheep run rampant through this area. Now they rapidly increase in numbers, and of course Kamehameha loves that because he then makes sure the makana are then ordered to, on particular orders, to catch 20 cattle, butcher them, salt them down, and then he trades that to the Europeans, Americans for guns and cannon. So this becomes the first of the economic trades between the Hawaiians and the European Americans. But the system is explicitly between the high chiefs and the European Americans. And the other chiefs on the other islands do the same thing, but they never understand how it works as well as he does. So he basically increases his military power, but he does it at the cost of the food, because these animals are eating up the food system. And what this means for the Makainana is all of a sudden they do not have food. Those fields are the ones that fed them. The chiefs are still insisting to pay their taxes, which are paid in food, to the chiefs to feed them. So what happens is the Makainana, if they're going to have enough left to feed the chiefs, there's now no food left for themselves because the cattle, the sheep, and the goat have ate all the stuff. So very quickly, the cattle, the sheep, and the goat get to the point where they literally denude the entire vegetation system. By the 1830s, when the missionaries have arrived, and they have mission stations all over through here, they very quickly point out and start complaining to the guys in charge, both the monarchy and their leaders in Honolulu, that all of their Hawaiian converts in this area have left because the vegetation is gone. It's now turned into ranch. And of course, this is Parker Ranch. And in that process, all the food is gone and all the people have left, or else they stay here and they starve. So what happened is among other things, this area now, if we actually zoom in here, let's take a look at this. So here's an image from this area. You can see it's all in what little sort of vaguely pasture grass and the kiawe and stuff like that. There's not even the vili trees we have in Southeast Maui. This place is entirely nuked. This was all agriculture. This was all a field system up to about 1810. By that time, by 1800, but certainly by 1810, this entire area looks like it does now. And in that process, there's no place for people to live anymore. Where you would have had hundreds of people living, maybe now you got one paniolo chasing some cattle up and down the hill. So what happens, if you notice, it goes all the way into the distance here. You lost this entire food source, you lost your population, you lose your power base. So ironically, what you had is Kamehameha's immediate needs for weaponry, and then later other stuff, sort of blinded him to the fact that he was committing classic sort of environmental degradation intentionally. The cattle, the sheep, and the goat aren't let go and just sort of run rampant. The cattle, the sheep, and the goats were protected by the high chief for the purpose of running rampant to make money off of them. So this whole thing was a calculated move on the part of the high chief to achieve a particular goal. Now, the irony, of course, is if he hadn't been successful in taking over the islands, he would have been well and truly screwed because he lost his entire population base. I mean, this was where his army came from. This is where the food came from. This is where everything that made him who he was came from. Look at this entire area. This bugger is all dirt. This was all green. This was all fields. This supported a population of probably between, 75 to 100,000 people. Yeah, you'd be lucky if you could have 10,000 people surviving there now. And that's entirely intentional. Granted, the animals didn't get out of control, but too late already. So when you look at the Big Island in the system, this is an important part to remember. The chiefs were responsible for a lot of these changes. This was not inflicted. The missionaries had squat to do with this. They hadn't even arrived yet. They're not even going to be here for another 20-something years. This was a thing done by chiefs for very explicit, temporary, short-term gain, and totally saying screw it when it came to the long-term implications. They weren't stupid. I mean, after a couple of years, they must have known that the animals were destroying their people's livelihood. But they needed the animals for money. They needed the animals for things they needed now. And very much in the way that we make decisions now, which are incredibly stupid in terms of long-term impacts, especially environmental ones. You see the same phenomenon was no different. The human species is very good at focusing on short-term goals and totally ignoring long-term consequences. And it was no different back in 1800 than it is in 2020. It's just sad because you have even more evidence and better predictive models about what's going to happen, and we still totally ignore it. So the chiefs were just, especially Kamehameha, were just very good at what they were doing for what they wanted as individuals and their immediate goals. Now, in the short term, of course, what that means is that's why you end up with a monarchy here. The long-term environmental consequences, that just, it was what it was. And still, to a certain extent, it is what it is now. The average temperature in this region is probably 3 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it was. There used to be mist, for example, all the way down here to right where this little number is, 19 is. So this whole area was covered in mist every morning. Temperature was significantly lower. It was in dry forest and fairly complicated systems. Now, I mean, you drive down from here and, I'm sure in the next couple of weeks, if it stays the way it is and as dry as it is, this whole area is in drought. Somehow a match is going to light up and the area goes poof yet again. So that's an important part of this to remember, that a lot of these changes are intentional based on short-term logic, but don't necessarily take all the parameters into play. And it's real easy in 20 to say, well, this was a really stupid thing to go, how could you think of that? But you have to remember, when you're standing somewhere, the world looks totally different than it does with 20/20 hindsight 150, 200 years later. I can guarantee 50 years from now, people are going to look at the stuff we're doing now, they're going to think, what the hell were you people thinking? Why was there an argument about masks? Why was tourism made so central in so many economies when it's so obviously fragile? What the hell why could you guys be so stupid? And they'd be right. With hindsight, in 2020, it's not, it just seems, well, this is going to work. This is going to generate money. This is going to be what I want. And this is what I feel my rights are. So I'm going to do it. It is who we are. And so, when we look at the period of the monarchy, it's important to remember, yeah, you can diss them. And in some cases legitimately, because, for example, Malo is a great critique. He does a great critique of this whole idea. But nonetheless, if that hadn't happened, we probably wouldn't have a monarchy and we'd be someone's dependency, the British probably. We would have been a British colony. So what happens. You can sit there and you can mull it over, but it results in the cards that you've dealt with in today's terms. Now, the other part that's important to remember, which also sort of ties into this, is that when I was talking about the idea of mana, and I think I mentioned this, mana is not only, for example, in spoken, in the sense that the energy that you take air into your lungs, what you think in your head, and the noise comes out of your mouth. So for chant, for example, is an expression of mana because of the energy, the life energy it takes to generate it. Knowledge is also mana, which I think I mentioned. So learning something is seen as acquiring mana. Having knowledge of something is mana. So to a certain extent, if I'm teaching you guys something, I am giving you mana in the classic Hawaiian view of what education is. And Charlot's work goes into great amount of detail on that. But it's also important to remember that you see this a lot, and one of the frustrations you have if you didn't get involved in Hawaiian studies, is that there's a sort of a precept, and I'm not sure if it was traditional, but it's certainly true by the 19th century, that you never give up everything that you know to the people you're teaching. Because there's an attitude, if you give up everything you know, you basically are giving up all of your mana. So this classically, you see this with kumuhulas, for example. They might teach their best, apprentices 90% or 95% of what they know, but there'll always be something they keep with them. And that sort of keeps them going, but it's also seen as their link to mana. So you never give up everything, because in doing so, you basically sort of unplug yourself from mana. So when the Europeans show up, you have to remember these highly opportunistic Hawaiian chiefs see the Europeans as a new source of mana. So when Kamehameha is talking to Vancouver and any of these other guys, he's not only learning things in the modern way that we think of it, he's also giving himself mana. And you have to remember, he's originally a Ku priest. He's a kahuna for Ku. So his whole world consisted of acquiring and using mana. And he sees the Europeans in the same way. He basically sees them as sort of like generators. If he learns that stuff, he gets it. But it also means in many cases he doesn't want to share it, because in sharing it, he loses that mana. So what you happen is the different chiefs, and pretty much all the chiefs jump on this with both feet, is they very quickly want to have Europeans around. They want to have European stuff, because European technology is also mana. A European cannon was not just a military weapon. A European cannon was also mana, because it was a expression of a set of knowledges that you could, if you had more than other people had. So yeah.
Sorry, I just want to ask a quick
No.
question. Would you say that there's like, or is there any like examples of like knowledge that's been lost because people have been unwilling to want to share it down the generation?
Oh, tons. I used to know AP and I pretty well. And he would always talk about the fact that Lua, which is men's martial arts here, he knew about, I think he used to say 7 different ways to kill people that were taught in traditional martial arts they learned back on the Big Island. He taught 2 of them. The other 5 died with him. Men's martial arts in Hawaii is one of those areas that there's I'd say maybe 20% that's still around. And if you think about it, if you're thinking of knowledge, martial arts would be one of those areas where if I'm a kumo, if I'm a teacher of that, I would pretty damn well make sure there was always a part of it that I kept. Either I don't trust my apprentices to treat it properly, and I know in Abe's case, at least 1 or 2 of the ways that he knew you could kill someone with, he thought that it'd be very easy for someone to lose their temper and use it wrongly but unintentionally. And I don't think his view of people wasn't as cynical as mine, but he was pretty cynical sometimes. And so I think his view was also that you couldn't teach something if you couldn't guarantee how it was going to be used. So yeah, there's tons of stuff that have disappeared. A lot of Hawaiian agriculture has disappeared in terms of ways of doing things. Yeah, I mean, the list just goes, it's a depressing list, but yeah, it's just like all over the place. You don't see that in the European. In fact, the weird thing, if you think the flip of that, I'd say in the modern, especially American system, people pretend to have knowledge when they don't. I mean, you look at YouTube and God knows politicians and stuff like that, they talk about it as if they know what they're talking about, they don't know shit. So I'd say the weird thing is in the American-European system, especially American, at least in my view, there's an attitude that you can pretend you know stuff when you have no idea what the hell you're talking about. In the Polynesian system, and again, this is not uniquely to Hawaii, you see the same thing in Samoa or anywhere else. There's a very strong attitude that knowledge is something you take very, very carefully, you hold it very close to yourself, because to a certain extent, it represents and reflects and generates your life energy. And what that means is every generation, stuff disappears. And you can try to replicate it. Tengen talks about this in some parts, but you can't. It's gone. So there's men's martial arts is probably the ones I'm most familiar with, because Abe and I talked about that a couple of times. But yeah, I think almost any area of Hawaiian knowledge, the amount that you have is really small. And again, if you want to think about classic example of Polynesian Voyaging Society, you bring in Mao from the Micronesian island groups to reteach Hawaiian and Polynesian navigation, because most of that had been lost. Those Tonga that used to teach and know navigation, in many cases for whatever set of reasons, left with that knowledge in them. And so you had to reconstruct, guys like Thompson, all those guys have had to basically reinvent and rediscover systems that no longer are, through time.
So is that like a Hawaiian concept and not Polynesian concept too?
Oh no, it's Polynesian. It's Polynesian. You see the same thing, at least in Tahiti, which is the area I'm most familiar with. Yeah. You actually also see it in Melanesia. It's certainly true in my area of study, which would be New Caledonia. Populations there have the same thing. Knowledge is something that you actually treasure because it's mana. So it's exactly the same concept as here. But there is an attitude that you never give up everything you know. In fact, from my Native American background, that's also true. Cheyenne and Arapaho do that. You know, I know stuff from my great grandma and my grandma that they never told anyone else, but I know that they were both shamans and they both, most of what they knew died with them. They didn't want to share it, you know. So yeah, I don't know. I don't think I'd call that in all cultures. It's certainly a lot of them, especially I'd say cultures that have a very strong sense of mana or chi, the Chinese would call it, very much so. Yeah.
Thank you. That's fascinating.
Sure. Yeah, it is. It's an addictive thing when you start to get into it, because you realize everything you look at. I think anything, even with Hawaiian language, any Hawaiian word, there's probably a whole mess of meanings that existed that have been lost because the people that use them didn't want to give them out for whatever set of reasons. So you're always looking at like the tip of an iceberg. And this is true of a lot of cultures. You know, many cultures are not subject to visible analysis, you know, in the way I think American society, which is almost too transparent. They're, you know, you never know, you know, anything you're looking at is very much a very small part of something much more complicated, which you're probably never going to really understand. It's certainly true of my area, East Maui. You know, on one hand, I know that place intimately. I've walked every inch of it, but I still know absolutely nothing about it. You know, the minute you think you know something, that just says, oh, that's so dumb border. You know, what do you think you know? You know, nothing, which is true. So key with this is, again, this idea of mana. This becomes key because you have to remember this becomes part of the chief's agendas. And most importantly, it becomes the Kamehameha's agendas. Him in particular, but also his family, the folks that become called Kaumanu Ma, the Kaumanu followers, the Kaumanu family. Because she's his, I can remember his second or third wife. Keopulani is his most powerful wife, but she's one of his other wives. But she was his political twin. The two of them are like a very complementary set of characters. They used to really get into it. There's a famous story, I think, of the Russian or the French expedition comes here. I think it's the Russians, and Kaumanu and Kamehameha are getting into a fight, and they're living in the house I think he had in maybe on Lahaina. And she literally throws him out of the house, literally right through the wall. So I mean, the two of them, I mean, they were both big. He was big and she was big. But they were both, I mean, I can guarantee they were arguing about something about politics or something like that. She was probably as smart as he was. She was just as aggressive as he was. But she's also a very fascinating example of how this whole thing played out, because she's the daughter of the high chiefs of Hana on Maui. His dad comes over and wipes those high chiefs out. Kamehameha was actually responsible for sacrificing a lot of her relatives, including her brother, on the heiau for his father. So on one hand, he kills most of the male members of her family. On the other hand, she's then married to him. She doesn't have any say in it. She becomes his wife. He takes her as a wife. I think his dad probably gives it up. But then she switches her loyalty over and becomes his chief advisor, his chief this, his chief that. But I think in part because of her, my guess would always be just from the dynamics of it, the fact that she'd lost her family when she was fairly young, due to fighting by the chiefs. I don't think any of her family dies of old age. They're all killed either in battle or after battles. So when she becomes, you know, part of his family, I think to her, in a very focused way, there was a really clear attitude that she was not going to let this crap happen again to her. So she becomes probably a bigger push for the idea of the Kamehameha dynasty than maybe even he was. And no one's ever going to know unless you go back in time. The two of them are both so smart, and they both thought so much alike in many ways. It's hard to figure where one stopped and the other started. So when he gets ill and he dies, she takes over. So Kamehameha dies and Kaumanu takes over. And she takes over for two very explicit reasons. One is that she wants to make sure this destabilization doesn't occur. And secondly is Liholiho, his firstborn son, or I should say his most powerful son, was groomed from birth to basically be close to a god. Liholiho is basically a result of a semi-PO marriage, and someone I think actually did their paper on this. which is actually where you marry very closely with either half brothers, sisters, or cousins, with the idea that the child that results from that intersection, that procreation, will actually be a higher chief or a higher engine than either of the parents. Keopuolani was one of the highest ranks you could be in the Hawaiian Islands. So when Kamehameha marries her, and Liholiho is a result of that, he's actually higher ranked than his dad. So for example, when Liholiho's even a fairly young kid, Kamehameha has to approach him in a prostrate thing. He can't be standing up higher than him. Liholiho was basically seen as the highest rank of chief that you could have and still be on earth. So as oftentimes in European accounts, he's called a god, and that's not really quite right, but he certainly was incredibly high ranked. And so in that situation, obviously Kamehameha was figuring that given the logic of the system, no one would give him a lot of crap because he was about as high rank as you could get. But on the other hand, given the fact the other chiefs didn't like any of the Kamehamehas, they're perfectly willing to whack Liholiho given half a chance and then worry about the consequences later. So that strategy didn't play out. Liholiho, on the other hand, was brought up to basically replace his dad as the priest, the head of the coup order. He doesn't do it. He won't take the responsibilities on. He's growing up. You have to remember, he's growing up at the time the Europeans are showing up. He develops a real taste for alcohol and good times. Because he's a such high rank, you can't make him do anything. He's like the ultimate spoiled kid. He's so high ranked. He'd be like I don't know, probably the British royal families like that. Everyone's got to go on bend the knee to you. So no one's going to tell you, hey, dude, you got to get your shit together. You got to grow up. You got responsibilities. You can't say that to him. So he's just going to do whatever the hell he wants. So pretty much he takes on some stuff, but he picks and chooses what he wants to get involved in. He wasn't particularly interested in politics. He would get interested in particular things that would sort of intrigue him for all, and go sort of wandering off. So he was sort of a loose cannon. And he sure as hell was nothing like his dad. So when Kamehameha dies, Kaumono puts herself as regent. She basically says, okay, my husband's dead. I don't trust, she doesn't say this, but I don't trust Liholiho to do a good job of managing stuff. So I'm going to basically say, yeah, just do whatever you want to, hang out, have a good time, have a few beers with your friends, and I'll run stuff for you. And Keopuolani, his mom, goes in a deal with Kaumono, so the two of them sort of co-manage the Hawaiian state. Liholiho is sitting there as Kamehameha II, but these two ladies, his two moms, because he was Kaumono's Hanai son also, are basically the ones running the monarchy. And they're both adamant they are not going to see themselves on a heiau, and they're not going to see their son on a heiau because of mismanagement. They're going to make sure the sucker continues. So it's their agenda that leads to the biggest, most dramatic change in probably in Hawaiian history. And that's because you've got this dichotomy in the system, and Kamehameha, of course, was the result of this. And this is the dichotomy between political rulers on one hand and religious rulers on the other. And again, I mentioned this before. Remember, he's actually, when his dad dies, his dad on his deathbed tells his half-brother, you're going to be the political leader of my country, the moku that I'm in charge of. And he tells Kamehameha, you're going to be the religious leader under the coup to generate mana for your half-brother over here. So you're supposed to be the foundation supporting him. Well, the two of them couldn't stand each other. In fact, there's some rumors that, I think it's John Papa'i that says that when they were kids, that one of the half-brother tried to throw a spirit cam or something like that. So these guys are really sort of Game of Thrones bad blood. So the end result is that Kamehameha, using his religious prerogatives, wipes out his half-brother and takes control, which is not the way you're supposed to do it, but no one was going to tell him how things were supposed to. He's going to do it the way he wanted to do it. So Kamehameha comes to power by using his religious prerogatives to destroy the political half of the family. Now, of course, now that he's dead, and Liholiho is not taking over that religious role that was planned for him, his moms are very, very clear that it's not going to take an idiot to realize that they can do the same thing to the Liholiho that Kamehameha did to his half-brother. So in a European sense, they're worried that someone who's in the church is going to decide they want to be in charge of the state. And there's not very much you can do about it, except, and this is where Kaumono is actually just an amazing woman. I put her up to like Catherine the Great or Queen Elizabeth I or something like that. She comes up with this incredibly genius move by her standards. And again, remember, it's in the standards of what she was aware of at the time. She decides that the big problem she's got, because there are actually revolts happening from 1806 on, There's a bunch of revolts against Cam, and he just stomps on them like a brick. When he starts to get ill, there's a bunch of people rumbling they're not going to put up with his son being in charge. In fact, the minute that Leo comes to power, there's a big rumble over on the Big Island. There's another big revolt over there, and they have to send troops over there. And so everyone can sort of see this whole thing crumbling really quick. And Kalmano decides the only way you're going to do damage control isn't to go and stomp out fire after fire. That's not going to work. What you have to do is you have to find somebody to just nail the sucker at the base. She decides that the huge problem is religion. She decides that the huge problem is the fact that you have a group of priests, especially the coup priests, but she just sort of decides kahuna in general, who are not necessarily particularly beholden to the chiefs, the political leaders, especially her son. That the only way you're going to get stability is to get rid of this set of players in the game. If you've got the religious and you've got the political decides the only way they're going to get in charge is to the religious. So she reverses what her husband did. Now, of course, you see this in Europe in the 1600s. This is where you start to get the separation, the dominance of the political realm over the religious realm. The Catholic Church moves from being the major political force to being a supplemental force, and your King of France, Elector of Germany and stuff like that, take control as political leaders and pretty much pound the church into place. That's what the Hawaiians, and that's what Kawamono does in 1819. It has to be the slickest version that I've ever seen. And the lady was an absolute genius when it came to playing the crowd. Because when you think about it, she's in a really weird situation. She can't say that the priests are wrong because it's the priest mana that makes the chiefs who they are. The Kamehameha power base is based on the traditional religion. So she's got to be very, very careful about how she fiddles with all this. And she lets these suckers know she's after them. And they're just going to declare a religious war, and they're just going to wipe the Kamehamehas off the planet, never going to hurt them anymore. So this is an incredibly dangerous game she's playing. This is total classic Game of Thrones if you ever watched that show. So in that situation, what she does very cleverly, she realizes anything she does will be held against her. So what she does is she takes one of the things that priests were in charge of. And of course, priests were responsible for kapu. It's the priest that generated most kapu. It's the priest that punished you if you broke kapu. And the function of Luakini Puakanaka Heao was the places where you spectacularly showed the results of breaking kapu by sacrificing people to remind people that the rules that were enforced and defined by the priest. So what she does, she goes to the high priest, who was no friend of hers, by the way. And she tells him, Leo, we were hanging around and talking story. And he said, he really wants to have lunch with Keopuolani and I. So we said, yeah, okay, we'll do that in a couple of weeks. Let's do lunch in a week and a half. Now, she intentionally tells the priest this because one of the things you could not do, especially with Leo because of his rank, is you could not eat with him. And especially as women, you could not eat certain foods with him. In fact, you couldn't eat certain foods with men at all. But secondly, you could not have lunch with him where you're sitting together because no one was allowed to sit with the same eye elevation. This is still a very big thing in most of Polynesia. If you want to show respect, you stay lower than the guy in charge. So in this situation, she's intentionally laying the sucker out. And she's breaking 6, 10, 15 different kapu, any of which would result in death normally, even if you're a high chief. So she does this intentionally. So she's baiting this guy. She's baiting the high priest and also his coterie of followers, the other priest. And of course, they go absolutely ballistic. They just start foaming at the mouth, literally, and just sort of this is totally crazy, that everything's going to get destroyed. The gods are going to come and Ku's going to come and stomp your ass, and, and this is just, worst possible idea. And she just, I don't care. We're going to do it anyways because Leo wants to do it. And because he is who he is, he has more of a say in what the relationship is with the gods are than you guys because you're just priest. So, of course, that she baits him even further. So they start to go public with this. They actually say, the regent and her sister, her, co-wife and the king are planning on having a lunch, and this is anathema to the gods, and it's breaking a bunch of kapu, and bump's going to result. And they basically make this as a proclamation. And of course, she's just sitting back there watching the priest do this because they're just playing right into her hand. Then what she does is she basically keeps her silence, but she makes it and they have lunch. My understanding is, Leo has like a bottle of gin or a bottle of wine or something like that, and everyone has a good old time and nothing happens. So what she had him do under pressure of his mom, Keopuolani, was write up a proclamation that she has stashed away So the minute that lunch is done, it must have been a fascinating lunch because, you know, at some point, all three of them must have really thought, they must have believed in this religion. They must have thought, I wonder if the gods, you know, lightning bolt's going to come down and whack us. But when it didn't, I think it was like, you know, like the gamble had paid off. The proclamation basically then says, the priests have told you over the last X number of days that all these things will happen if these kapus are broken. The fact that we did this and the kapus did not result and the gods did not punish us means that the priest view of the religion is false. They have been lying to you. Now you have to remember that any religion is entirely belief-based. You can't test religions for their efficacy. You can't say Christianity is a more true religion than Islam or Buddhism, because the followers of each of those religions will believe their religion is the best. It's always belief-based. It's not subject to testing. You can't have like a version of the Survivor show with religions playing it out and see which religion, quote, wins. Religions don't win. So in that situation, one of the downsides of that event, of course, is if you somehow shake people's belief in their religion, all of a sudden, bang, it's like living in a glass house and the religion just shatters. And that's what she did. It wasn't what she intended to do. But of course, no one had ever done this in any other society ever. It's never happened in history that I know of. So she had no idea what the consequences were going to be. She obviously thought she knew what the consequences were going to be. She's going to get rid of these pain in the ass priests that were compromising the ability of the Kamehameha family to keep power. But what actually happened is the place just went insane. The Makainana took the proclamation and sort of added 2 and 2 and got 4, which was that if they didn't just see it as the priests that were making the proclamation, which was sort of the coup priesthood, which is the one she wanted to go after, they decided that what the king was saying was that all priests and all the religion were false. Or not so much the religion was false, but the way that the religion had been preached and promulgated to the commoners was false. And so they just went on a rampage. And the Europeans that were here at the time, and it's fascinating to look at the letters from, you know, 1819, 1820, everyone was like freaking out. The whole place was almost like post-apocalyptic. There were commoners going down the streets, destroying Heiau, burning down things, burning down Ki, hunting down priests. There's 2 accounts by one by a French guy and one by Marin, who was living in Honolulu at the time, of folks in the top of priests getting caught by commoners and literally being torn apart like a chicken right in the street. The commoners just decided they were going to gut this sucker. And when you think about it, it makes sense. The commoners paid for the religion. They paid for it with their labor. They paid for it with their food. They paid for it with their lives. Because by the 1700s, there were a number of very oppressive kapu that were being laid on commoners. All sorts of things you couldn't do, or just sort of the list was like endless. It was constantly being added to. And it was the priests that always enforced these. It was the guards or the bodyguards of the priests that were the ones that would grab people. There's the famous heiau at over in Waianae, Kumai Po, which is one that always brings chills down my back when I go up there. And there's 2 villages that lived around there in that part of Waianae. And there's the heiau there. And the name of the heiau is Ku, so it's a Ku heiau. It's the warriors that walked down the stream below there to arrest villagers for making noises on the nights that they were supposed to be quiet. On nights when there was not supposed to be any noise, if your dog barks or if your kid cries, the entire family's grabbed, taken up to heiau and sacrificed. That's the world that the Makainana lived in. So when someone said these guys are full of crap, they didn't make any distinction. They just nuked the whole system. Now, what didn't occur to Kaumanu in all this, of course, is that also then cut the legs off of the monarchy, because the monarchy was dependent on the concept of mana and power for their legitimacy, in the same way that the Church of England is responsible for holding up the British royal family, because the Church of England is the royal religion of the English state. So she, in one fell move, by getting these guys to make a set of predictions and then proclaiming that these guys are full of crap, she had basically tanked the entire religious system. This is called the overthrow of the kapu, but it's more accurately the overthrow of the religion. Because at that point, then the royal family, for example, had to go into hiding. Kaumanu, everyone disappeared into the hillside because they weren't sure when this was going to end, but they realized very quickly that the commoners, once they had done their number on the priests, would go around thinking, hey, wait a second. What about these other guys that are in charge? They've been just as much a pain in our ass as the priests were. So let's clean them out too. So you basically go from order to anarchy in about 72 hours. And this sort of, post-apocalyptic zoo went on for about 18 months. Now you have to remember there's already hundreds of Europeans living here. And apparently a bunch of them are trying to get the hell out of town because they weren't sure where this was going to stop. But they realized that basically now the Makana found themselves in a situation they could basically clean up shop in any way they wanted to. The only parallel I can think of would be the collapse of the French monarchy. And then the result when the Republicans and the other groups in places like Paris took over and basically erased any aspect, both the Catholic Church, the French nobility, they just gutted everything. So burning down a library, everything made sense because you just didn't like it. That's sort of where Hawaii was in 1819. Now there was a huge social impact because you have to remember in a pre-literate society, a huge part of the knowledge of the Hawaiian culture was held by the priest. There were priests that were not only in charge of things like, mana, there were also priests that were in charge of agriculture. They were the ones that kept track of how the streams were managed. There were priests, of course, that was your kahuna lapao. They were the priests that were in charge of healing. But when everything went nuts, people didn't make a distinction. Now, not every place did this. In my section of East Maui, for example, in Kanaia-Oahe, there's a very strong oral tradition that people there respected their local priest, who weren't coup priests, and actually hid them in caves for almost 2 years, till the dust died down and the witch hunt, for all intents and purposes, stopped. Now, in the middle of all this sort of, insanity, that was structured by one intentional event for a very logical purpose, but got totally out of hand. All of a sudden, sailing in from Boston, of course, they'd left a year and a half earlier, for I think Providence, Rhode Island, or Boston, or someplace like that. In comes a boat with the first group of missionaries that are supposed to preach the word of God and protect the Hawaiians from the avaricious European Americans who, at least the folks in New England saw, were trying to screw the Hawaiians over. Because you have to remember, by 1895, on Vancouver's expedition, he has, I think, 4 or 5 Hawaiians on his ship. The whaling and trading ships that come over all have Hawaiians on them because they were great sailors. People wanted them as crew. There's a guy whose name starts, Owaihi, I think his name is. You have to look, I can't find it. It starts with O. Who becomes famous in New England in the early 19th century for going on the talk circuit with the New England Missionary Society in New England and telling everyone what Hawaiian society's like. This drums a huge amount of interest and money and support to sending down a group of missionaries, not to just convert the Hawaiians, but also save Hawaiians from the Europeans that are bringing prostitution or bringing alcohol and are bringing all sorts of bad things to the Hawaiians. So you have to remember that one of the main functions of the missionaries was to educate and protect the Hawaiians from the bad Euro-Americans. So they came over here with a very strong sense of moral obligation, and of course a huge chip on their shoulder. They happened to arrive right after about a year and a half after this insanity started in Hawaii, triggered by Ka'aumanu. Now, the minute she sees them arrive or hears them arrive, she just, because the lady, again, you have to remember, she's opportunistic and she's incredibly sharp. And she goes, hey, wait a second. Okay, the old religion is now tanked. I hadn't planned on that happening, but it happened. Now, what I'm going to do, since she already knew about Christianity, she had, there was Young, Davis, there were a bunch of Europeans and Americans that were actually chiefs by 1819 in her immediate family. So she knew how Christianity works. She, people hadn't tried to missionize yet, but the religion wasn't odd to them. So she says, hey, wait a second. This is just like what these guys said. If we bring these Christian missionaries and embrace them, we use their religion to re-legitimize the royal family. So the political structure of the Hawaiian state becomes dependent upon the New England missionaries because they're the ones, the new religion is going to replace the old religion that got tanked less than 2 years earlier. Now, from the missionary standpoint, it's fantastic. Here they thought they were going to have to compete with an existing religion. They were going to have all these priests to fight with and about, what's the true religion, what's the true God. And instead they come in place and just poof, it's anarchy. So they jump into it with both feet and think, oh, we've got this system. But it's important to remember that until 1840, Ka'aumanu and her family, in many cases, would throw the missionaries out or would completely just gag them. The missionaries did not come and change Hawaiian society. The high chiefs, the Kamehamehas very particularly, embraced the missionaries for the political purpose of saving their political dynasty, and in doing so legitimized the New England Missionary Society version of Christianity and made it the new state religion. The missionaries didn't sell her on it. She grabbed hold of it. In fact, the early records of, when Bingham, who was the head of the group when he arrives, he's totally shocked that Kaumanu immediately says, hey, what's this new religion about? I'm really interested. I want to become a member. And he's like, dude, we don't even know you. So it isn't the compelling nature of the religion, it's her political practicality. She needs this new religion to replace the one that she tanked less than 2 years before. So when the New England missionaries come in, they find themselves sponsored by the state. So they don't come in and bring a new religion, just change this place. This place had already gone through a stunning, enormous amount of change. They just up in that weird sort of, by their view, the right situation at the right time, and they're smart enough to take advantage of it, and the two groups coexist. Now, of course, what the chiefs and especially Kaumanu didn't realize is the New England missionaries and their Christianity were part of a global world order that was already encompassing most of the planet in colonialism. So the Hawaiian chiefs didn't realize they were very small players in a very, very large game. The New England missionaries, on the other hand, realized they were pretty big players in a very, very large game. So the two groups think they're working together, but they're not really. They're not antithetical necessarily, but they had very different ideas of who is in charge, who is in control, and who is going to make sure that this went the way they wanted to. The chiefs, especially the Kamehamehas, thought they were in charge, and they're not really disabused of that till probably about the 1840s. By then, of course, the vast majority of the missionaries weren't missionaries anymore. You have to remember, most of the missionaries leave within 2 years of arriving here. In some cases, they leave for other locations. In most cases, they become landowners and become the economic engine that then drives Hawaii into the 19th century, especially through the plantation system. So the missionaries were never game changers by arrival. The missionaries were made into game changers by the Hawaiian chiefs. And it's Kaumanu that, for example, by 1823, 1825, sends out proclamations to the entire islands that everyone is going to become Christian. And the version of Christianity they're going to listen to is the New England missionary version of what's oftentimes called Puritan Calvinism. So it's the chiefs that make that happen. The missionaries don't suddenly arrive and have a bunch of Hawaiians fall on the knee and go, oh, we want to be like you. Just like the stereotype of Cook arriving in the Hawaiian chiefs going, oh, we want to be like you. It didn't happen. So it's a much more complicated, much more sophisticated dynamic process. The last point with all this is important to remember is that by the time of the Kamehameha being in power, by about 1805, when he's finally taking control of the dust has settled, he's still alive. He makes it very clear that what he's going to do is he's going to make sure that all the families that are related to him have to live with him. This is very much something that you see very much in Asia. I'm not sure they did in Europe. So any of the families that could cause trouble, he makes sure they live next to him. So he sort of got them as hostages. Now, what he does then is he gives them property, and they start to sort of play games. He doesn't want them playing military games. He doesn't want them playing dominance games in terms of actual control of property. So what happens is they take this concept I mentioned at the beginning of class, which is this idea of mana as knowledge, and then mana is also stuff. And he says basically, well, why don't you guys show how powerful you are by virtue of who has more stuff and who has more sophisticated stuff? And of course, the key players are going to be the Kamehamehas themselves because they have access to more resources, they have control of the system. And so this becomes the new system under the Kamehamehas, is that other chiefs now compete with each other. Because you have to remember, Hawaiian families still are incredibly competitive today. And Hawaiian chiefs were always stunningly competitive. That's the whole ruling chiefs book. So what he does is he shifts that competition from killing each other, beating the crap out of each other, to basically being more sophisticated consumers than each other. And so what you get is what I call the warehouse period. And what you get is chiefs that have anything immediately build places to store, and they buy stuff from the Europeans. And they use their access to resources in Hawaii to provide for those things. And in doing so, they show their mana in the same way traditionally they would have done by taking over part of an island or doing a ritual at a religious site or whatever. Now it's acquisition of stuff. So the chiefs become like uber consumers. And the classic story is Liho had a ton of warehouses, at least 2 in Lahaina, that were full of like Chinese silk, crystal chandeliers from Austria, all sorts of stuff, cases of champagne, all of which just went bad because, the storms would blow the roofs off the warehouses and everything would just get nuked out inside. He didn't care. It was just stuff. But having it made him the king. He was the chief acquirer of stuff. Therefore, that was represented the fact he had more mana than anyone else. So this is what happens with the high chiefs. The chiefly system here turns into something like, as I've got here, like Japanese royalty. They quit being involved in politics, which is what especially Kaumana wanted. She didn't want him involved in politics. What they become is they become interested in having a bigger house than their neighbor, having a nicer carriage than their neighbor, having more clothes than their neighbor, having bigger parties than their neighbor, you know, bigger luau, whatever. So in that situation, this shift is of incredibly fantastic utility to the Kamehameha dynasty because it gets rid of competition. Now, of course, the downside, if you're the Makanana's, this makes you even less happy because this becomes, what if you read your throne stuff, this becomes the sandalwood period. The sandalwood period is impossible to understand unless you understand the fact that the chiefs aren't no longer acquiring weapons. Now they want goodies. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because this is a real tricky, it's a hugely important part of Hawaiian society and Hawaiian change. Because otherwise the missionaries either get credit for everything or blamed for anything, depending on how you want to look at it. And they weren't. I mean, we were a Hawaiian state. We weren't a missionary state. So it's important to understand that the chiefs are making what at the time seemed like perfectly logical, very clever, especially Kaumana decisions that make a hell of a lot of sense from that point in time. Consequences 50, 100 years later, a lot more iffy, but that's it. So this is what happens. Along with this, of course, between the depopulation of areas due to the grazing animals, abuse of commoner labor or the Makanana labor for the purpose of acquiring stuff by the chiefs. All this just gets to excess. And again, Salin's book on Anahola is a beautiful example, like somebody's already looking at, is how the chiefs move into consumerism and do so, abuse their responsibility to the commoners. Because the original role of chiefs, of course, was to give mana to the land and mana to the commoners. And the commoners respond by respect and respecting the authority of the chiefs. But the minute that, of course, by 1819, when that's no longer happening, the mana isn't being given by the chiefs. And in the type of Christianity that shows up, as we'll see, it's a very individualistic form of Christianity. It has nothing to do with the role of chiefs. In fact, the New England missionaries were adamantly anti-royalty. So in that situation, that relationship's now collapsed. So now the chief is more like a landlord. And there's no system of moral social obligation between these two. It's just that he has the ability to intimidate you to make you do stuff. So as populations of people get ill, as situations get really bad, what you find is huge amounts of outmigration in many parts of the Hawaiian Islands, either moving to parts of the islands which seem more attractive. So the population in Lahaina, for example, jumps up tremendously with folks from Maui and the Big Island, stuff like that. Because Lahaina is the main thing is where Europeans are at and where things are happening. So if a chief's telling you you've got to keep on farming the land, you still screw you and you just get out and you leave. This is also when Hawaiians jump ship in huge numbers. Huge numbers of Hawaiians leave on vessels, either to migrate to the US mainland. There's a whole town still of Aloha, Oregon, which might have burned out, I'm not sure, but where Hawaiians moved in the 19th century to join the logging industry because it just wanted off the Hawaiian Islands. It was too oppressive here. Tons of Hawaiians were recruited to work on sailing ships. So Hawaiians were leaving for a bunch of reasons, but the main reason is they didn't like the system anymore. They didn't see that it was in their favor. There was no religious logic or belief system was holding it together for them anymore. And this is what happens to the Hawaiian state. The backbone of the Hawaiian state, the Makanana, lose their relationship, you might say, with the priest and with the chiefs. And at that point, then everything starts to sort of go like this. I think that's one of the reasons why that people then especially the Makanana, turn more to the old religion. And you start to see more interest, for example, in the idea of the family, the idea of clan, the idea of family traditions, because they no longer see the monarchy as actually being something they're heavily invested in. And it's important to remember because the monarchy in the 19th century was not something that all Hawaiians bought into. They did not see it as theirs. They saw it as the prerogative and purview of the chiefs. It was something that chiefs were into. Chiefs were into doing that, not me. Which in some ways you sort of see some sort of similar pattern today discussing about the role of politicians vis-a-vis their constituency right now in the United States, which I think is probably would sound very familiar to Hawaiians you know, back in that period. Someone's going to come here. Wait, let me check it out. Really? What's that? No, what's that? What's that? I never heard that.
So Portland has, I guess, for a while had a very high influx of Hawaiians.
Yeah.
It kind of set out to be a semi-white utopia. They made laws to try to limit the amount of people that came in. So they had something called the lash laws, where basically if you lived in this area and you weren't white, they would lash you either 8 times total or lash you once every year. And obviously,
Oregon was famous for that. Yeah. Oregon might seem liberal in the 21st century, but trust me, I lived there for a couple of years. It's not very liberal. Yeah. You're totally right. That's why I think they lived in their own communities in Central Oregon. Just, you know, out of sight, out of mind. But yeah, a lot of them moved around Seattle. There's still large Hawaiian communities that date from the 1840s, 1850s. There's a bunch of Hawaiian communities that moved to Utah when the Mormons come here really early. I think 1840s, 1850s, you have to check, I don't remember. And there's tons of Hawaiians that moved to Utah, and there's families that still live there. The date from, again, this sort of mid-monarchy period. So yeah, you're totally right. Yeah, I hadn't heard that one, but it's totally not a surprise at all. One thing that's really weird, and again, probably tied to this, is you don't find a lot of Hawaiians moving to California, which again is probably because like Oregon, they had very low tolerance for anyone other than the, you know, accepted group. So yeah. So yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's welcome to Anglo-America. So yeah, so I mean, and that's probably one reason why a lot of them went on ships. I've never seen any study done of how many Hawaiians end up in New England. I know for a while there was a really large population in Boston and Providence, Rhode Island, because they would come back on the whaling vessels and just set up shop there. But yeah, there's you know, Hawaiians became one of the most migrant populations probably of the early 19th century in terms of getting out of town. And I think Malo and Kamakau both complain about that. Malo wrote a bunch of letters in the newspapers complaining about the monarchy driving Hawaiians away. So this was a big issue at the time. You know, on one hand, populations were dying off, but you almost never hear much discussion about the number of people leaving, which had to be in the thousands, you know, leaving Hawaii just for greener pastures. Yeah. Okay, does this all sort of make sense? It's been a lot to sort of go through, I think. Okay, I'll take silence as a yes. So on that point, let's stop with that. That gets us up to the mid-monarchy period. Actually, the next panel is all part of that, what I talked about already. So we should actually go good on that. Yeah, next we got to get into is land. And that's, again, you got to remember that we've sort of set up the foundation for that. I'd say that everything that happens after 1830 as a result of what happened in 1820, 1819. So that, understanding that, everything that happens even down till today makes a lot more sense, including the ambivalent response that a fair number of Hawaiians have towards the monarchy. The monarchy is a very interesting symbol for folks that identify with being Hawaiian. So, okay, if we're all good, we'll call a halt to the party.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, so see you guys, today's Tuesday, yeah? Okay, see you guys on Thursday then. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.